Most people think survival is about what you have, the right gear, the right food, the right weapons. History disagrees. Because when the grid goes down, truly goes down, not for a few hours, but for days, weeks, or longer, the most dangerous variable isn't your equipment, it's your location. And the places that feel the safest right now are often the exact places that become the most lethal when the lights stop coming back on. We're not talking about fiction, we're not talking about movies. We're talking about the documented, measurable, historically verified pattern of what happens to human beings when complex infrastructure collapses. It happened in Puerto Rico after Hurricane Maria in 2017, where the grid stayed dark for nearly a year in some regions. It happened in Lebanon beginning in 2019, where rolling blackouts stretched into permanent darkness for millions of citizens. It happened in Venezuela, in ice storm-paralyzed Texas in 2021, and across the Soviet Union as that empire quietly disintegrated and the supply lines that held civilization together simply stopped. In every single case, people died not because they lacked survival instincts. They died because they were in the wrong place when the system failed around them. So before we get to the list, understand this. The grid is not just electricity. The grid is water pressure, hospital function, fuel distribution, communication, refrigeration, and social order. When it collapses, it doesn't collapse cleanly. It collapses in layers, and each layer that falls takes something else with it. Here are the 9 most dangerous places to be when that process begins. Number 9. High-rise apartment buildings. This one surprises people. It shouldn't. High-rise buildings are engineering marvels specifically designed to function within an active power grid. Elevators, water pumps, HVAC systems, fire suppression, electronic door locks, all of it runs on electricity, and backup generators exhaust their fuel, typically within 24 to 72 hours. A high-rise doesn't become a home, it becomes a vertical trap. During Hurricane Sandy in 2012, residents of high-rise buildings in Lower Manhattan found themselves stranded in the dark, carrying water up 20, 30, 40 flights of stairs by hand. Elderly residents on upper floors were effectively immobilized. But Sandy was temporary. Now imagine that situation extending not for 5 days, but for 5 months. During the Beirut economic collapse, residents in multi-story apartment blocks watched their building infrastructure deteriorate in slow motion. No elevator fuel, no municipal water pressure above the 3rd floor, no way to cool or heat sealed concrete towers. People migrated downward over time, abandoning upper floors the way ancient cities abandoned their outskirts during siege. The psychology of a high-rise during a prolonged grid failure is one of progressive helplessness. You are entirely dependent on systems you cannot repair, cannot fuel, and cannot replace. The survival logic here is altitude, not the romantic kind, the punishing kind. Every liter of water you need becomes a physical burden measured in flights of stairs, and in a true grid-down scenario, you will need a great deal of water. Number 8. Hospitals and care facilities. This requires careful framing because the instinct when something goes wrong is to go to a hospital, and in a short-term emergency, that instinct is correct. But in a prolonged grid failure, hospitals transform from sanctuaries into some of the most dangerous congregations of desperate people on Earth. Consider what a hospital requires to function: uninterrupted electricity for ventilators, dialysis machines, surgical lighting, refrigerated medications, electronic records, and sterilization systems. Most hospitals carry between 72 and 96 hours of generator fuel. After that, without resupply, critical systems begin failing. During the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina in 2005, the conditions inside Memorial Medical Center in New Orleans became so desperate that the events that unfolded there became the subject of federal investigations and a Pulitzer Prize-winning book. The building became an island, supplies ran out, decisions no one ever trained for had to be made. Now consider what happens outside a hospital when word spreads that it's the only functioning medical facility in a region. People arrive, not dozens, but hundreds, then thousands. Some are genuinely injured, many are frightened and desperate. In the Lebanese collapse, pharmacies and clinics became flashpoints of conflict almost immediately once medication supplies dried up. A hospital in a grid-down scenario draws the most vulnerable and the most volatile populations simultaneously to the same address. If you are not critically injured, that address is one of the last places you want to be.
Gas stations. Every prepper knows to fill the tank before a storm. What most people don't fully appreciate is what gas stations become in the first 48 hours of a serious grid failure, and what they become in the weeks that follow. Modern fuel pumps are electrically operated. No power, no pump. Some stations have generator backup. Most don't. And the ones that do become immediate magnets for anyone who understands that fuel is about to become the first hard currency of collapse. In the hours before Hurricane Rita made landfall in Texas in 2005, the evacuation traffic jams were so severe that people ran out of gas on the highway. Fights broke out at stations. People were stranded. And that was a voluntary evacuation with advance warning, not a sudden grid failure. In Venezuela, as the Bolivarian economic collapse deepened through the 2010s, fuel queues stretched for literal miles. People slept in their cars for days to hold their place in line. Violence at fuel points became routine. The Venezuelan military was eventually deployed to manage distribution, which tells you everything about the social gravity that fuel creates when it becomes scarce. A gas station in the early hours of a grid failure is a place of maximum resource contention and minimum rule of law. It is a location where the ratio of desperate people to available resources moves in only one direction.
Number 6. Suburban neighborhoods with no walkable resources. This is the entry that will upset the most people, because the suburban home with the 2-car garage and the cul-de-sac has been sold to generations of Americans as the definition of safety and stability. And under normal conditions, it is comfortable, but comfort and survival resilience are not the same thing. In fact, they are frequently opposites. Suburban infrastructure was designed around one assumption, that you will always have a functioning vehicle and always have somewhere to drive it. Remove that assumption through fuel scarcity, road blockages, or simple mechanical failure, and the average suburban neighborhood reveals itself as an island. Food is miles away. Water is dependent on electrically pumped municipal systems. Neighbors are separated by fences, garages, and decades of social atomization. During the Texas ice storm of February 2021, suburban residents found themselves frozen in homes that were never engineered for serious cold, without power, without water, and in many cases without any meaningful relationship with the people living 30 feet away from them. People died of carbon monoxide poisoning trying to heat their homes with barbecue grills. People died of hypothermia inside houses, not in a war zone, in a suburb, in America. The deeper survival problem with suburban geography is psychological. Suburban residents are accustomed to privacy and independence. Those values, which are genuine and worth having in normal times, become liabilities when collective action and resource sharing are the difference between managing a crisis and being consumed by it. The Cuba Special Period, which began in 1991 when Soviet subsidies collapsed and the Cuban economy contracted by roughly 35%, offers the counterexample. Urban Cubans, dense in their neighborhoods, developed remarkably adaptive community food and resource networks. Suburban isolation offers no equivalent mechanism. When the grid fails, distance kills just as surely as temperature or dehydration. It just does it more quietly.
Number 5. Coastal tourist areas and resort towns. This entry follows a specific and well-documented collapse pattern. Resort towns and coastal tourist destinations share a structural vulnerability that isn't obvious until a crisis hits. They are optimized for consumption, not for production or self-sufficiency. Their entire economic logic is built around importing resources to serve transient populations. Food arrives by truck. Water is processed and pumped. Entertainment infrastructure dwarfs agricultural or medical infrastructure. When normal supply chains function, this is invisible. When they don't, it becomes catastrophic. After Hurricane Maria devastated Puerto Rico in September 2017, tourist-dependent coastal communities found themselves with depleted local food stocks because hotels and resorts don't stockpile for grid failures, they restock daily. And with enormous populations of confused, stranded tourists who had no local knowledge, no local contacts, and no plan. Meanwhile, roads were impassable, ports were damaged, and the communities that existed to serve visitors suddenly had to survive alongside them with a fraction of the self-sufficiency of inland agricultural towns. The death toll from Maria, now estimated at nearly 3,000 people, was largely concentrated not in the immediate storm impact, but in the weeks of infrastructure failure that followed. Tourist towns were among the hardest hit. The historical pattern repeats. In the aftermath of serious disasters, the communities that survive best are those with production capability, farming, fishing with actual infrastructure, craft skills, not those with the most polished presentation economy.
Number 4. Areas downstream from large dams. Most people think about grid failure in terms of darkness and inconvenience. Fewer people think about what grid failure does to water infrastructure, specifically to dams, and this oversight can be measured in lives. Modern dam operations rely on electrically powered monitoring systems, automated spillway controls, communication infrastructure, and emergency alert networks. When the grid fails, backup systems engage, but backup systems have fuel limits, maintenance requirements, and failure threshold. The 1975 Bangchao Dam collapse in China, triggered by a typhoon overwhelming an already stressed system, killed an estimated 170,000 people, not from drowning alone, but from the disease and famine that followed the destruction of surrounding farmland and infrastructure. That disaster predated widespread electrification of dam systems, but it illustrates the core principle manageable. A dam is a controlled catastrophe, kept manageable by constant human attention and functioning technology. In a prolonged grid failure, that attention and technology degrade simultaneously. The populations most at risk are those living in floodplains downstream, often precisely the flat, fertile, accessible land that communities have historically preferred. During the 2021 flooding in Germany's Ahr Valley, where dam and water management systems were overwhelmed in a matter of hours, entire villages were effectively erased. The residents had between 15 minutes and no warning at all. In a grid-down scenario where early warning systems are offline and communication is fractured, those 15 minutes may not exist. Living downstream of a large dam in a geography that offers no elevation and no natural escape route is a location decision that most people make without ever knowing they've made it.
Number 3. Densely populated urban centers. We arrive now at the entries where the calculation shifts from serious to potentially fatal. Dense urban centers are civilization's greatest achievement, and, in a grid failure of sufficient duration, its most dangerous concentration of human vulnerability. The numbers are stark. A city like New York consumes approximately 36,000 tons of food per day. That food arrives by truck, by rail, by ship, a continuous logistical heartbeat that stops almost immediately when fuel, communication, and distribution infrastructure fail. Studies of urban food security consistently find that most cities carry between 3 and 7 days of accessible food supply at any given time, distributed across supermarkets, restaurants, and homes. After that window closes, the social mathematics of scarcity begin operating in ways that history documents with brutal clarity. During the siege of Leningrad, which began in September 1941, one of the most advanced and cultured cities in Europe descended into conditions within months that required official bread rations of 125 grams per day for civilians, roughly the weight of 2 slices of bread, and documented cases of people consuming sawdust, leather, and wallpaper paste. The siege was military in origin, but its mechanism was identical to what a sustained grid failure produces: severed supply lines, trapped population, finite resources, and no external relief. Nearly 800,000 civilians died. Leningrad was not a city of weak or poorly organized people. It was a city caught in geography that made escape nearly impossible and resupply nearly impossible simultaneously. The modern urban grid failure scenario does not require a military siege. It requires only that trucks stop moving, pumps stop pumping, and social trust erodes past the point of collective cooperation. In large cities, that erosion can begin within 72 hours of a serious disruption. The Los Angeles riots of 1992, the New Orleans breakdown after Katrina, the early days of the COVID supply panic, all of these were partial, temporary disruptions, and all of them revealed the fragility of urban social order under resource pressure. A true, prolonged grid failure in a major urban center would apply that pressure at a scale and duration that no modern Western city has experienced in living memory.
Number 2. Areas directly adjacent to critical infrastructure. Power plants, water treatment facilities, fuel depots, military installations, communication hubs. In normal times, living near critical infrastructure is often considered desirable. Good roads, employment, sometimes even aesthetic appeal. In a grid failure, proximity to critical infrastructure makes you a neighbor to the most contested and potentially volatile real estate on Earth. When the grid fails, the people who understand what these facilities contain will move toward them. Fuel storage at a regional depot becomes the most valuable object within 100 miles. A water treatment plant with backup generation becomes the center of a resource negotiation or a resource conflict. During the collapse of the Soviet Union, the informal seizure of state industrial assets by those with the knowledge, proximity, and willingness to act was so rapid and comprehensive that it restructured the entire Russian economic landscape within years. Those who lived near oil infrastructure became oligarchs, those who didn't became poor. The mechanism was proximity, knowledge, and the collapse of the enforcement structures that previously regulated access. In a faster, more violent grid-down scenario, that same dynamic plays out under pressure and without the moderating influence of any functioning legal system. Security forces, whatever remains of them, will concentrate around critical nodes. Armed factions, whether organized or improvised, will attempt to contest or control those same nodes. The civilian populations caught between these forces, living in the neighborhoods that happen to surround a power plant or a fuel terminal, face a specific and acute danger that has nothing to do with their own behavior and everything to do with their address. Number 1. Wherever you are, if you have no community. The most dangerous place to be when the grid fails is not a location on a map. It is a social condition, and it is historically the single greatest predictor of survival or death in every documented collapse scenario. The North Korean famine of the 1990s, known as the Arduous March, killed between 240,000 and 3.5 million people, depending on the source. The survivors, documented in defector testimonies and academic research, shared a consistent pattern. They had networks, family networks, village networks, informal trade networks, even black market networks.
The people who died were disproportionately those who were isolated, single adults without family ties, people who had been politically marginalized and cut off from community resources, the elderly without children nearby. Not because isolation is inherently fatal in comfort, but because in scarcity, cooperation is a survival technology as powerful as fire. Every other location on this list can be mitigated, if you have people. A high-rise is dangerous alone, manageable with a coordinated group. An urban center is lethal if you are competing for resources with strangers, survivable if you are sharing resources with trusted allies. The Cuba Special Period produced genuine hardship, but it did not produce mass starvation because Cuban communities maintained extraordinary social cohesion and government-organized rationing that, whatever its political character, kept collective logistics functioning. The communities that collapsed most completely in every historical example were those where social trust had already eroded before the crisis arrived.
The bonus insight, the 72-hour window. Here is the survival concept that most preparedness content underweights. Every crisis has a critical window, and it is almost always the first 72 hours. Not because that is when the physical danger is highest. In a prolonged grid failure, the physical danger builds over weeks, but because the first 72 hours is when decisions calcify. People who leave urban areas in the first 72 hours encounter empty roads. People who leave at hour 96 encounter traffic jams, fuel shortages, and deteriorating social conditions. People who wait a week may not be able to leave at all. This is not speculation. It is the documented pattern of every major evacuation event in modern history. The psychology of the 72-hour window is shaped by denial, the deep human preference for believing that the disruption is temporary and that normal service will resume. History is not kind to that preference. The people who acted in Leningrad's first weeks, who found routes out before the ring closed, survived in numbers disproportionate to those who waited. The people who evacuated New Orleans before Katrina arrived faced inconvenience. The people who waited faced catastrophe. The 72-hour window does not mean panic. It means that your decisions about location, where you live, where your community is, what routes you know, what resources you have pre-positioned, should be made now, in comfort and clarity, rather than in the first terrifying hours of a genuine grid failure when every other frightened human being is making those same decisions simultaneously. The summary: 9 locations, 9 variations on a single underlying truth. High-rises trap you vertically. Hospitals concentrate desperation. Gas stations become flashpoints of resource conflict. Suburban isolation eliminates cooperation. Coastal tourist towns are built for consumption, not survival. Dam downstream geography makes you a hostage to infrastructure failure. Urban density amplifies every shortage. Critical infrastructure adjacency puts you in the center of the most violent resource competition. And isolation, wherever it exists, is the condition that historical evidence most consistently associates with preventable death. Your geography is a decision. Most people make it without ever framing it as a survival choice. The ones who survive extended grid failures are, with remarkable consistency, the ones who treated it as exactly that. Know your ground, know your people, know your window. Stay prepared, stay sharp, stay alive.